General Psychology, Week 3, May 27th through June 1st. Okay, so our topics for this week are learning and memory. That's chapters 6 and 7 in the course textbook. You can earn up to 55 points this week, and the way you'll earn those points is by completing the class participation, which is CP3. You can earn up to 10 points, 6 points for making initial posts, and 4 points for responding to 2 or more classmates. Remember, both your initial post and your responses to peers must be substantive. P3 is an outline of your paper. So in P1, you selected a topic and narrowed it down. In P2, you gathered resources and created an annotated bibliography. And now in P3, you'll make an outline of the paper. Quiz, you'll earn up to 20 points for completing P3. And now quiz 2 is worth 25 points, and that's based on chapters 1, 2, and 3. So make sure you've read those chapters prior to taking the quiz. Quiz 2 has 11 multiple choice questions and 1 short answer question. Now, in addition to earning these 55 points and reading the chapters on learning and memory, you are also expected to be working with your group members on your eventual group project. Now, the group project isn't due until June 14th, but you're expected to be making small steps toward completing this project, as soon as working on it basically week by week. On the next slide, I'm going to go over the quiz 1 results. I'll tell you a little bit about the class statistics and some tips on how to improve for the upcoming quiz. And then the remainder of this slideshow, I'll give a few pointers on test 1 and some more information about the group project. Chapter 6, Learning. So this is a chapter that many people get mixed up on the terms. So I really encourage you to read the chapter from start to finish. On the slide here, you can see that there's an outline of the entire chapter. And we're going to start with the definition of learning. If you look up learning in a dictionary, like a Webster's dictionary or on dictionary.com, you're going to get a different answer than what you're going to find in our course textbook. And that's because psychologists define learning in a very precise way, okay? So I really want you to be mindful that what you find on dictionary.com or in Webster's dictionary, that's not going to cut it for taking the quiz, for truly understanding what learning is. If you'll think back to chapter 1 when we talked about behaviorism, the learning theorists basically spring from the behaviorists. So in the beginning of the chapter, you'll learn a little bit about classical conditioning, and I've linked a short video that I've created going over classical conditioning, giving you a real life example. But classical conditioning started with basically Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist, but his work with digestion in dogs led him down a path where he basically discovered classical conditioning. Now, John B. Watson is the person who took Pavlov's work and applied it to humans and is credited with kind of being like the father of classical conditioning. Then we'll move into operant conditioning, which is a little different than classical conditioning. Think of classical conditioning as dealing with automatic reflexes, whereas operant conditioning is dealing with more voluntary, deliberate behaviors. In operant conditioning, usually Skinner gets a lot of credit for being the founder of operant conditioning, but in fact, E.L. Thorndike was working with cats in puzzle boxes at the same time that Pavlov was working with dogs on, classical conditioning. So you can read a little bit about instrumental conditioning and operant conditioning in the course textbook. Now, the rest of the chapter covers topics that are, I think, more straightforward. There's a section dedicated to biology and cognition and how they relate to learning. And this is basically saying that for a long time, psychologists who were, part of the behaviorist movement, they didn't give a lot of credit to cognition, and they didn't give a lot of credit to biology. So basically, they were ignoring nature for the sake of nurture. But nowadays, we know that biology constrains and facilitates learning. And the same is true with cognition. The last part of the chapter deals with learning by observation, and this is observational learning. Albert Bandura is going to be the theorist that's most aligned or associated with observational learning. You'll hear the term modeling or imitation. These are also used interchangeably, as well as observational learning, social learning theory. So in this theory, you learn from watching others. So like I said, I encourage you to read this chapter in its entirety. You won't be tested over this information until you get to the midterm, but you will be tested over the information in the midterm. So it's worth it to learn it. In addition to learning it for the sake of the test, the more you learn about learning, the more you can apply it to your life and become more strategic with how you interact with your environment and basically take yourself to another level. Memory, Chapter 7. Chapter 6 and 7 really go hand in hand. And this is a chapter that most students really enjoy reading because there's so much practical information in this chapter that can help you in your personal life, in your professional life, and in your academic career. After all, what are we but a collection of memories? Think about all the times that you've had in your life. Imagine if you weren't able to draw from those experiences and those thoughts. So memories are such a big deal. And the chapter is laid out in such a way that you start off with trying to understand how cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists in general study memory. One way is by using an information processing model. And then we move from there to talking about encoding. Encoding is basically getting the information in, and it's how you build memories. From there, we move to memory storage. And so this is how the brain retains information. We talk about synaptic changes. So this is short-term and long-term memory. And finally, getting the information out, or retrieval. Many people say that memory in its simplest form is a three-step process: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Getting it in, keeping it there, and then pulling it out. Now, obviously, cognitive psychologists are going to spend a lot more time dissecting the topic of memory and breaking down each of those sections, but that's basically what memory is. The rest of the chapter is dedicated to talking about forgetting, memory construction errors, and improving memory. So I really encourage you to take a look at the video that I'm linking in this slide, and also reading the chapter all the way through. Quiz 1 results. So on this slide, I'm going to talk about two topics that we need to go over a little bit more based on the results from Quiz 1, the class statistics, and then some tips on the short answer questions. We're going to actually start with class statistics. 25 students completed this quiz. 5 students scored an A, 4 students scored a B, 4 students scored a C, 6 students scored a D, and 6 students failed the quiz. If you failed the quiz, don't be alarmed. I offer one cumulative quiz at the end of the semester, and you can take that quiz and it will sub in for this quiz if it's your lowest quiz score. All right, the quizzes are intended to help you test yourself prior to the midterm, because the quizzes are relatively low stakes. We have 4 quizzes, each worth 25 points, and the midterm is worth 100 points. So quiz 1 and 2, that's 50 points. It gets you ready for test 1, which is worth 100 points. And that's part of the reason why I'm going over the 2 topics, because I don't want you to make the same mistake on quiz 2 or on the midterm that you made on quiz 1. All right, so our average was 69% and the high was 100%, which is pretty good. Basically, even though our average was technically a D, it was closer to a C than to an F. All right, with that said, let's move right on to the topics. The 2 most frequently missed questions, I'm going to go over those. The first one, strong drives such as sex cause people to behave in certain ways. This statement is most closely aligned with which school of psychology? I'm going to read that again. Strong drives such as sex cause people to behave in certain ways. This statement is most closely aligned with which school of psychology? The correct answer was psychoanalytic. Several people wrote behaviorism. So I wanted to clarify why psychoanalytic was the best answer. We had 28% of the class answer this question correctly. All right, so I have a comic here on the slide, and it's a picture of a dog laying on a couch who's seeking therapy from a psychoanalyst, it appears. Okay, and the dog says, and then it hit me. I'm salivating over a goddamn bell. All right, so this is supposed to be funny because it's basically mixing or contrasting behaviorism and psychoanalysis, which are the two big schools of thought in psychology's history. All right, so up here I have a picture of Freud, and I also have a picture of Pavlov. And as you all know, Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a technique of counseling people, and the main goal of psychoanalysis is to have the person share their ideas, their thoughts, their feelings, and not guard themselves. And the therapist or psychoanalyst analyzes the person's random thoughts. They analyze the person's dreams, their jokes, because the goal is to get to the unconscious. Okay? So with psychoanalysis, the therapist is the person in control or in charge. Now, keep all of that in mind when you think about psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory runs parallel with psychoanalysis, the therapy. You will also see the term psychodynamic. The main difference between the terms psychodynamic and psychoanalytic is that psychodynamic includes Freud and the Neo-Freudians. So in other words, there were other people like Erik Erikson, Karen Horney, lots of other people who agreed with some of the basic tenets of Freud's theory, but they didn't agree with everything. So they remixed it and remodeled, the theory to come up with a new, better, remixed version. So psychoanalytic theory is usually referring to theories that are very similar to Freudian theory, okay? Whereas psychodynamic is like they're in the same vein, very similar, but not exactly the same thing. They've made some modifications. All right, so with behaviorism on the other hand focuses on overt actions, what you can measure, what you can see. And so behaviorism is about studying people to understand what makes them do what they do. But if you can't measure it and you can't see it, then it's not worthy of being studied or mentioned. So even though when we talk about behaviorism, we're talking about Watson and Skinner, those are like the two big wigs, and E.L. Thorndike, a lot of people will include Pavlov as a behaviorist. Now, in truth, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. He was a scientist who was studying the digestion in dogs. And so he really wasn't a psychologist. And he didn't have a lot of warm feelings, warm fuzzies about psychology. But his research on classical conditioning basically laid the foundation for, behaviorism adapting classical conditioning as a way to treat people with phobias and change behavior in other ways. So psychoanalysis is about the unconscious mind. Behaviorism is about overt actions. Psychoanalytic theory proposes the idea that sex and other innate drives move you to behave in certain ways, whereas behaviorism posits that you're rewarded or punished, and that's what makes you do what you do. So in the question that we read, when you see the word strong drives such as sex cause people to behave in certain ways, this should let you know that they're talking about psychoanalytic theory, not behaviorism. All right. The second most frequently missed question was concerning correlation. And the question read, suppose the correlation between children's body weight and their reading ability is negative 1.0. This means that among children, better reading ability is associated with lower body weight. That was the correct answer. I'm going to read it one more time. Suppose the correlation between children's body weight and their reading ability is negative 1.0. Okay, and the correct answer was, this means that among children, better reading ability is associated with lower body weight. Okay, so the question I read on the previous slide was about correlational research. And I pulled this definition directly from my course textbook. It says correlation is a measure of the extent to which two events vary together, and thus of how well either one predicts the other. The correlation coefficient is the mathematical expression of the relationship, ranging from negative 1.0 to positive 1.0, with 0 indicating no relationship. So I put a graphic on the screen because this is how I typically explain it in a face-to-face classroom. Just think of correlation as two things being connected. So two, related. So correlation is about finding if there's two things that are connected, they're related with one another. In this picture that I have on the slide, we have mental health index and income. So we're trying to find out, is there a relationship between health and how much money you make? Now, the thing to remember with correlational research is correlation doesn't equal causation, okay? Two items can be correlated, and you can make predictions about one item by knowing the other if they're strongly correlated, but it doesn't mean that the one item caused the other item. There's always something called the third variable problem. So in our example, suppose the correlation between children's body weight and their reading ability is negative 1.0. What that means is there's a perfect correlation between body weight and reading ability. So we can predict a child's body weight by knowing their reading ability, and we could predict their reading ability by knowing their body weight. Now, because it's negative, it means that as one variable is going up, the other is going down. If it was positive, then both variables would be going in the same direction. So on the example that we have on the screen, the mental health index and income, each dot represents an individual person. And you'll see that there's a trend forming that shows us probably a positive correlation between health and income. So basically, the more money you make annually, the healthier you are. Think about all the reasons why this might be true. It's possible that because you make more money, you're able to eat healthier food. Or it's possible that because you make more money, you're able to go to a gym. Or because you make more money, you have less stress. Or because you make more money, you're able to visit the doctor. Any of those other factors could be the reason why people who make more money tend to live longer and tend to be healthier. So a correlational study is just going to show if there's a connection. It's not going to show if one variable causes another variable. So in our class, 40% of the class indicated that there's very little statistical relationship between children's body weight and reading ability, and that is absolutely wrong. The correct answer was 32% of the class answered, and this would mean that among children, better reading ability is associated with lower body weight. Tips for quizzes. So the first thing I want to mention is the short answer portion of the quizzes. On the quizzes, you want to make sure your short answer responses are complete, correct, clear, and concise. So by complete, I mean thoroughly answer all parts of the question. Don't leave any opportunity for missed points. So if the question asks about neurocommunication, then you want to at least mention the electrical activity, and you want to mention the chemical messengers, so neurotransmitters. You probably would also want to mention dendrites and axons and synapses, but at least mention the core elements of neurocommunication. So make sure your answer is complete. By correct, make sure your information is accurate. Leave out your personal opinion, your thoughts, your feelings, unless the question asks about your thoughts and feelings. Instead, focus on the information that you glean from reliable sources and relay that when you're answering the question. Okay, by clear, proofread your response and eliminate typos and grammatical errors. Also, use headings or spacing. So if the question is posed in a way that it has three parts, A, B, and C, when you respond, answer with A, B, and C. Use spacing or bolding if necessary, but you want your response to be complete, correct, clear, and concise. By concise, we mean don't ramble, don't make it redundant, don't put a bunch of fluff and fillers in there. Just make sure your answer is getting the job done. Okay, now some other tips I have on the slide for quizzes in general. Read the chapters prior to taking the test. when you take a quiz or a test, know that it's based on the information that's presented in the textbook, and that same information is available in the modules. I develop all of my quizzes and tests, and often I use test banks. So I'm telling you the secret. The secret is make sure you've read the textbook, make sure you've looked over the information in the modules. Okay, be mindful of the time allotted and plan accordingly. So with the quizzes, you have about 25 minutes to answer 12 questions. So you want to work, relatively quickly, but not so quickly that you make errors. Okay. Decide if you want to answer the short answer first or last. For some people, you might decide that you spend more time on the short answer portion and you'd rather get that out the way first. You can do that. Even though the questions are presented one at a time, you have the flexibility to go forward or backwards. So you make that decision prior to taking the quiz and then, respond accordingly. Next, I have skip questions you're not sure about and come back to them later. When you're taking the quiz, you want to build your confidence. So if you read a question and you can't come up with the answer, you're not so sure about it, go ahead and skip it and move on to another question. And I suggest this for a couple of reasons. One, the more correct answers you answer, the more you're going to build up your confidence. And two, it's possible that you might find the answer to a previous question further down on a different question. Okay, so it's best to use the test as almost use it against itself. All right, be strategic and have confidence. So, you can do better on the test than you think you can, because there's test-taking strategies that you can employ that will allow you to be successful. And I've given you some links on the upcoming slides of videos that I encourage you to watch, and also page numbers in the textbook that also give you tips. Okay, so tips for tests. We just went over tips for quizzes, so it's really the same thing. But basically, here's a link to one of the videos that I recommend. It's by Stephen Chu. He is a cognitive psychologist. He's a professor, and he talks about how people can study really hard and still fail, or you can study really hard and do, wonderful. So he has a series of videos, and he's going over actual experiments and then real live examples. But I encourage you to watch at least one of the videos because he gives practical advice and things you can use right away. And it will help you in this class and in other classes, both online and face-to-face. In our class textbook on page 24, there's a list of items, suggestions that I think are worthwhile. And they also are strategies for improving your test scores. Now we have our midterm. I'm going to encourage you to be prepared ahead of time, because the midterm is worth 100 points. And even though you'll have more time to complete the midterm than you did the quizzes, you have a lot more questions. There's 50 questions and there's 5 chapters. So you're going to need to space out your studying. The good thing is you will have been quizzed over chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so the only new information is chapters 6 and 7. Now, if you have questions about the midterm, you can use the questions thread and I'll be happy to respond. I'm planning to host at least one live session where we can Zoom whoever is interested and go over, some sample questions. AutoLock provides on-demand proctoring services for schools and universities. Their simple, affordable platform operates around you. No scheduling, headaches, or bulky software downloads. CF prioritizes academic integrity and has partnered with AutoLock to hinder cheating using their patented mobile device detection system. Tests 1 and 2 and alternate test 1 will be administered using AutoLock. So I'm going to make an AutoLock practice quiz available the end of this week, and I suggest you take it anytime prior to taking the midterm, because when you take the midterm, you will be required to use AutoLock, which is a proctoring service, as I just read. The group project, we're coming to the end. Hang in there, people. So in the first week of the class, you were assigned a group project, And really all you needed to do was to review what was expected of you for this group project and kind of get to know the classmates in your learning team. In week 2, you were given a topic, and the goal was for you and your group members to narrow down the topic. Now in week 3, I'm expecting that the group will research their topic and start assigning roles to different group members. In week 4, you'll probably want to be pulling the presentation together, actually developing the presentation. And then in week 5, the presentation is due. So the actual due date is June 14th, and one member will upload a slideshow, a YouTube video, a PDF, or whatever you guys decide, however you guys decide to develop your equivalent 15-minute oral presentation. One person will upload it with everyone who contributed names on it, and then I will release it to the class in week 6, and you'll get feedback from your class in week 6. You'll also get feedback from me in week 6. That's all, folks. You made it to the end.